In current society, gangs and gangsters have a very stereotypical look and role. But were they always like this? Where and how were gangs started, and what kind of people were typically members? In American history, the first gangs were mostly made up of new immigrants. Some of the first gangs were predominantly Irish, such as the Wyos and the Dead Rabbits. The Wyos were New York City's dominant street gang in the late 19th century. The gang basically ruled Manhattan from the 1860s to about the 1890s. They were led by Mike McGloin, and they would willingly participate in extortion, prostitution, and murder if they were paid enough. They actually had a list of deeds they would perform for a certain amount of money. The list consisted of punching for $1, both eyes blackened for $3, nose and jaw broke for $7, jacked out, which meant being knocked out with a blackjack, a small club made from leather-wrapped lead attached to the end of a leather-wrapped coil spring, for $15, ear chewed off for $15, leg or arm broke for $19, shot in the leg for $20, stabbed for $20, or doing the job, which meant murder, for $100 and up. Eventually, McGloin was arrested for the murder of a saloon owner, and slowly the gang broke up because so many people were arrested or killed. After these very influential Irish gangs were mostly dismembered, the Italian Five Points Gang came into power. This gang became one of the most infamous gangs in U.S. history and changed the way gangs were perceived in America. Paolo Antonio, also known as Paul Kelly, was the Italian-American who began the Five Points Gang. Antonio was also the man who introduced Al Capone to the world of gangs. The Five Points Gang controlled the area that is now known as Chinatown in New York City, which at the time was considered a slum and housed the settlements for poor immigrants. The way the Five Points Gang made money was by supporting corrupt politicians and by rigging the elections. The Five Point Gang's only rivals were the Monk Eastman's gang, which was a Jewish gang. These two gangs would openly participate in warfare and would often have gunfights that would result in multiple deaths. Eventually, the Mafia took control of the area, and some of the former Five Points members joined the Mafia gangs. When the 18th Amendment was passed and Prohibition ruled the streets, bootlegged liquor became a popular source of revenue for the Mafia. From the 1940s to the 1960s, there really wasn't one main gang that controlled the streets. There were several smaller gangs, simply called fighting gangs, including the Fordham Baldies, who shaved the bodies of the people they kidnapped, the Puerto Rican gangs like the Viceroys and the Dragons, which were formed mainly for protection purposes, and Italian gangs such as the Red Wings. These gangs were led by younger members, and they would often fight each other to the point where people were actually dying. These gangs would even murder innocent people who just happened to enter in on their designated territories. In the 1980s and 90s, street gangs were popping up everywhere. The two main gangs were the Bloods and the Crips of Los Angeles. These gangs were mainly African American and had huge influence on people all over LA. There were many ideas on how and why the Crips began, but many of these stories are just myths. The real reasons are not necessarily known, but many people have concluded that there was a group led by Raymond Washington that spread into several different groups all over the city. Over the course of the next few years, rumors and stories were made up, and these groups led by Washington adopted the name Crips to avoid being confused with other gangs. They used the color blue to mark their territory and identify their members. The Bloods were created simply to retaliate against the Crips. They chose the color red to symbolize their gang, and they were oftentimes a lot more organized than the Crips. They were first known as the Bishops, and were really made for survival's sake because of how much they were being tormented by the Crips, mainly due to territory issues. Both the Blood and the Crips are still around today, and the gang violence has all but died down. There are many celebrities who are pro-Blood or pro-Crips, and they have huge influence on the youth who are out on the streets. Snoop Dogg, Ice Cube, Coolio, and Richie Rich are some celebrities who are said to be members of the Crips. And Sinister, Birdman, Lil Wayne, Waka Flocka Flame, Tupac, and Ludacris are said to be members of the Bloods. Gangs have been around for decades, and although they are created for legal purposes, they create a sort of family that the members might not find anywhere else. I'm not saying that gangs are a good thing, but they have helped people feel like they belong somewhere, and they are a large part of our society, for better or for worse. Law officials have been trying to bring down these gangs for many, many years, but the different gangs have so much influence all over the country they will probably never be able to be fully eradicated.